Okay, what are the inflation's effects? Before jumping in, let me be clear. There is very little likelihood that this inflation is going to go away anytime soon. The Ukraine issue, the sanctions that I talked about before, if they have any effect, they will disrupt the global economy in a variety of ways. That will, if the past is any guide, make it more likely that prices will be raised by companies confronting disruptions in the global economy. I think we're going to see every business in the world take advantage of all of this turmoil, use it as one of those convenient scapegoats so they can get away with raising prices when it might have been harder to do so. We are already seeing companies position themselves so they can raise prices by suggesting they've taken this or that hit from the Ukraine problem and so on. It also means the governments of the world are scrambling around doing foreign policy, which usually means that the domestic issues get short shrift. It is remarkable how convenient this crisis was for the political problems of Boris Johnson holding on to his prime ministership in England by the skin of his teeth, if even that, with President Biden facing the lowest poll ratings of his presidency and indeed of almost every other. Here is flag waving and patriotism and all the rest of it, splitting, at least in part, the Republican Party. You can see that the Democrats have a lot going in this particular moment. But I want to talk about the effects of the inflation we have and the inflation we will continue to have. I've mentioned that it's a slap in the face at the working class population. I want to make clear that the effects of inflation worsen the inequality of wealth and income. I've already talked to you about that. The basic truth of it is this: the richer you are, the more mechanisms you have, the more ways you have to escape an inflation, to escape the effects. You can move your money from one investment to another, to move it away from one that looks like it'll be hurt by the inflation to one that looks like it will be helped by the inflation. And the rich, by the way, live mostly off prices. It's the rich people who get the dividends, the interest. That part of the price of every good that flows to them is what makes them rich. Workers get a wage. And when the price goes up, the wage either doesn't or doesn't go up as much. So what goes up even more are, the other parts of the price of everything, not the wage part, the interest part, the dividend part, the profits part. That's why the prices are raised, to get the profits up. So the people who get the profits, from the big salaries of the CEO to the dividends paid to the shareholders to the interest paid to the bondholders, they are the one who may get pieces of the inflation into their hands. The working class, no. And the United States, which was already suffering from the extraordinary inequality it has fostered in this country, will now see the inflation making it even worse. And if you thought that the inequality was a goad to the political problems we have, and most of you know that, well, then we're going to make our own problems worse by allowing an inflation to unfold. And I will have something to say about stopping the inflation in a few minutes. Okay. People that are really hurt by an inflation are those who cannot compensate for it by raising their income. Workers can at least try, maybe in a couple of years when their contract expires, maybe now by doing something like walking away from a job, which millions are doing, like building a union. And I just recently read that Starbucks not only has to have a union in its New York State stores up around Buffalo, but in Mesa, Arizona, another group of Starbucks workers has now voted to form a union. Yeah, of course, these workers, when they take militant action, can begin to take the steps. It'll take a while to have the union, to have it be strong, so it can force from the employer some improvement of wages, so they're not simply smacked by higher prices. But then there are people who can't do that. Think of the millions of retired people. They have a pension. Often, that pension is in a fixed amount of dollars. So as prices go up, those dollars buy less and less for these retired people. Let's see. People who've given a lifetime of work are now on a pension that gives them $800 a month or whatever it is, and now they're going to be able to buy 8% less than they were a year ago on that pension. There are millions like that. Our population has more older people than it's had in a long time. Then there's the people on the minimum wage. Can you believe it? We have a minimum federal wage in the United States of $7.25 an hour. It's been $7.25 an hour since the year 2009. That's right. It hasn't been, prices have gone up every one of those years, usually little, 1%, 2%. But now they're going up at 7 to 8%. But there's no movement to raise the minimum wage. There's nothing happening. You are savaging people at the low end of the scale. They were already living paycheck to paycheck. Tens of millions. And now the paycheck goes 8% less than it did before. What possible justification is there? But I'm not done. Here's some more effects of inflation I want you to think about. And remember now the difference between inflation here in the United States right now, 7, 8%, and inflation in the People's Republic of China right now, less than 1%. That means goods made in the United States are going up in price by that inflation rate. They go up just like everybody else's prices do. That means the exports of the United States are going to be more expensive for people abroad. They have to pay the higher prices being charged. And you know what? Many of them won't. And you know where they'll go instead? They'll buy competing, Chinese goods, because they're only going up 1%, whereas the American goods, on average, are going up 7 to 8%. That means all over the world, including here in the United States, people will be switching from the rising price of American goods to the much less quickly rising prices of Chinese goods and goods from many other parts of the world. That's bad for jobs here. If people don't buy American exports, Americans don't have jobs producing those exports. Inflation is a job killer. And then there's another remarkable thing. As prices here make American goods produced here too expensive, as I just explained, it creates another incentive for employers to leave the United States. Don't be part of the economy here where prices are rising by 7 or 8%. Move your production to China or India or Brazil, where perhaps you can get a better deal, where the inflation isn't so bad, or it's offset by the collapsing currency values that they have. You begin to look harder for other places to go to, and that's a job killer too. Well, last point. One of the effects of inflation is more inflation. In other words, inflation feeds on itself. And to understand this, I'll give you two simple stories. Imagine that you are a person considering making a major purchase, furniture for your home, an automobile, something big. Well, once you understand what the inflation is, and you understand everything I've been saying, you will realize that the longer you put off the purchase, the more you're going to have to pay because the prices are going up. As Americans begin to understand this, and the same would happen anywhere else, they rush to the stores to buy sooner rather than later to escape the higher inflation price. But of course, what that does creates a burst of demand, which leads capitalists to say, hey, with all these people rushing to buy, let me jack up the price, because I know I got people champing at the bit, and I can tell them stories about how smart it is to buy now. Yes, it's 5% more, but I still would advise it, dear customer, because it'll be 20% more if you wait 6 months. That is happening all over. The inflation builds more inflation. Here's another way it works, okay? You're a businessman or woman. You see prices going up. You expect them, because you understand, to continue to go up. So you say to yourself, wow, I know I'm going to be squeezed by rising costs. So let me get a jump on the situation by raising my prices now. Maybe easier to do it now. I don't know how tough the situation will be 3 months, 6 months, 10 months out. So the very expectation of an inflation leads people to raise the prices, which literally brings to pass the thing they worried about even sooner than it might otherwise have come. All right, as we begin to wind this story down, let's ask the last obvious question about inflation. What do you do about it? Since it has happened over and over again, since capitalist economies are beset by the defects they have that impose inflations on us from time to time, like the business cycle, like the boom-bust crisis sequence over and over again. What can you do? Well, the standard response, which is all we have seen to this moment here in the United States, is to get the central bank, what we here call the Federal Reserve, to get the central bank to cut back on the money in circulation and to raise interest rates. And indeed, the Federal Reserve has announced that it is doing both of those things and plans to do a good bit more of it across this year, 2022. Now, what's the idea here? The idea is simple. It's whether or not the idea is realistic that's the issue. Here's the simple idea. If you pull money out of the economy, and that's what the Federal Reserve can do, reduce the amount of money, it means there's less money available to buy the higher priced goods. And the hope is that the employer class, the ones who set prices, won't be so quick to raise their prices because they will be aware that there's less and less money out there around to pay the higher prices. That's the hope. And raising interest rates, same simple idea. If it's more expensive to borrow money, the idea is, many business people will borrow less and spend less, and that's a signal to producers, don't raise up the price because people are already in a mood of spending less, and if you raise the price, they may not spend on you. That's the idea. It's a very gentle approach to induce the 1% who set prices not to raise them as much as they did before. But here are the problems, as always. First problem, and I could tell you many, but I'm going to tell you just a couple to give you the idea. The first problem is the stock market. Many of you have asked how the stock market figures in all of this. Well, here we go. Over the last 20 years, the Federal Reserve pumped huge amounts of money into our economy and lowered interest rates to zero and sometimes below zero. Historically unprecedented moves in peacetime. Why? Because the Federal Reserve was terrified that the economic crashes I mentioned earlier, 2000, 2008, and 2020, could, if they continued in the stock market, crash the whole economy and give us the kind of 10-year depression we had back in the 1930s. To prevent that, they flooded the economy with lots of new money and lent it to people at next to no interest rate. So, of course, what happened? That money could have gone into what it should have gone, into producing goods and services. Businesses that produce goods and services could have borrowed all that money at those low, attractive interest rates and produced goods and services and made a profit. But they didn't do that. Why not? Because our economy is now so unequal that the mass of the American people can't afford to buy much more. They are already spending everything they've got, and they're already indebted, borrowed up to their eyeballs. Mortgage debt, car debt, credit card debt, student debt, it's too much. So there's no point for companies borrowing all this money to produce more goods because the American people can't afford it. And the rest of the world buys things from China instead. So where did all the money go? Answer, stock market. People who play the market borrowed the money. Banks, insurance companies, stock brokerages, equity funds, all of them. They borrowed the money and they poured it into the stock market. So over the last 20 years, we've had a stock market boom. The inflation that didn't come in the world of goods and services did come in the stock market. And the rich people of America, they're the ones who own the stocks, most of them. 10% richest people own 80% of the stocks. They made out like bandits. For them, it's all about recovery. For them, our economy is doing great. For the mass of people who have little or no stocks, it isn't. They wonder who the economy is that Presidents Trump and Biden were babbling about. The money went into the stock market. But here's the problem. If you raise interest rates, like they say they're going to do, and if you pull money out of the economy, which is what they say they're going to do, then the whole thing holding the stock market up is going not to be there. And that is why in the first 2 months of this year, as all of this is taking shape, the stock market stopped going up and became very unstable, one day to the next, up and down, as people are trying to figure out what's going to happen here. Very fragile economy. And one of the effects of the inflation in the stock market is to make it very dangerous for the Federal Reserve. It has to stop the inflation because of all the reasons I just gave you. But it doesn't dare cut the money and raise the interest rates, because one of the things that will immediately happen is to really whack the stock market, and that whacks the rich people, and they're the ones that fund the political system we all live in. Wow. And you know, if you raise interest rates, you make car payments more expensive. You make your monthly credit card bill more expensive. Corporations who've been borrowing money like there's no tomorrow for 20 years, solving every problem they have by getting that massive amount of money at zero interest rate into their hands, because borrowing from the Federal Reserve was the quickest, easiest, cheapest way for every corporation to solve whatever problem it had. So they're in debt up to here, and if interest rates go up, their expenses to cover that debt at the higher interest, they can't do it. And here's the irony of ironies. For many companies, as they pay off their old debts and do what we call rollover, they pay off the old debt, they immediately borrow the money back because they need that money to function. When they borrow it back, they have to pay the new higher interest rate, not the old one that they are finished with, that old bond. that they were able to buy, to borrow at a low interest rate, they got to pay more now. As corporations, sir, how are they going to pay off higher interest costs? Here's what some of them will think. Raise the price. Use the extra money we can get from raising the price to pay the extra interest. In other words, the effort to stop the inflation by raising interest rates will have the perverse opposite effect of raising the inflation it was meant to stop. The inflation also had other effects. Senator Manchin from West Virginia was able to defeat the Build Back Better program of Mr. Biden by making the argument, if the government borrows tons of money to pay for the Build Back Better, then that's going to add spending to the economy. And in an inflation, that makes the inflation worse, because when there's more spending, companies will feel that, wow, we lost the Build Back Better in part because the inflation enabled that argument to be made. How interesting. And of course, if interest rates go up, people won't be able to afford buying a home. It's already priced out of the range of millions of young people in America. You know what this situation is, and this is a very important point for me to get across. This is a situation in which capitalism has come to a dead end, or to be more precise, to two dead ends. It can go this way or that way. But if it continues with the inflation, well, I've tried to lay out for you the enormous dangers that lurk there. But if it tries to stop the inflation with conventional monetary policy, wow, that leads to all the problems I just talked to. It's a dead end. It's damned if it does, it's damned if it doesn't. It will be in trouble if it goes one way, it'll be in trouble if it goes the other. Is there then nothing you can do? Not at all. I'm now not going to tell you something we might do. I'm going to tell you about a moment in American history when this country was confronted with an inflation even worse than the one we're in now, and it did something that stopped the inflation. It's August 15th, 1971. The President of the United States is a conservative Republican named Richard Nixon. He goes on radio and television on the 15th, and he says to the American people, we have a terrible inflation. Prices are going up in those days, as I say, faster than what we have now, a good bit faster. We have to do something, and I'm going to do it. And he declared what was then called, still called that, a wage price freeze. He said, as of tomorrow morning, it will be illegal for anyone, any employer capitalist, to raise a price, or any union or worker to demand a higher wage. We're freezing it. He says, if you're a business or a worker who raises a price or a wage as of tomorrow at 8 o'clock, we will come and arrest you and put you in jail for violating this executive order. Rising prices stopped on a dime. Don't tell me there isn't a solution. Of course there is. There was then. You don't have to guess about it. By the way, other countries have done this too. I only mentioned the Nixon example because we have in this country a remarkably selective amnesia problem. We don't remember the things we don't want anyone to know about, even though they're part of it. I didn't make this up about Mr. Nixon. He did that. And for the next several months, we didn't have an inflation anymore. But a lot of people were angry. They wanted to raise their prices. They wanted to raise their wages. And they went to work, put a lot of pressure on Mr. Nixon. So after about 8 or 9 months, they let it go. But by then, they had kind of broken the back of the inflation. People were now aware that the government was serious that the government would take real action. And I want to stress, it was a Republican, conservative, friend of big business who did it. Trump didn't do it. Biden didn't do it. Neither of them mentions this. Neither of them advocates anything. They mostly don't want you to think about the inflation, even though every visit to the store is a stark reminder. Could we stop it? Sure. Were there problems with a straight wage price freeze? Of course there were. But let's be clear. There's one set of problems if you freeze wages and prices. But you're not out of the woods if you don't. If you don't, you have the problem of inflation that I just took your good time to explain. Or you have the problem of the government cutting back money and raising interest rates, and I've just presented with you the tip of the iceberg of all the problems there. So yeah, a wage price freeze has problems. Any solution to these dead ends of modern capitalism have problems associated with them. Let me conclude by drawing your attention to the following thought idea. Is there perhaps a historic meaning to a society that produces dead ends for itself, that produces an inflation and produces a solution that is really touch and go as to whether or not it might be worse than the inflation itself? It can't tolerate the inflation, it threatens its existence, and it can't tolerate the conventional solution, and it can't tolerate thinking about the unconventional solution. It doesn't know what to do or where to go. Yes, I know some of you think that's the way it always is, and there's some truth to that. But I do want to submit to you for your thought, your consideration, that we have come to points in the capitalist economic system, especially here in the West, North America, Western Europe, Japan, that literally are policy dead ends. The conditions are unsustainable, the inequality, the crashes, the unpreparedness for the public health, the money policy that kind of spinning out of control. The solution looks as bad as the problem we're desperate to solve. I think these are signs of an empire and an economic system coming, however slowly and however back and forth and hesitant the steps are, coming to an end. I didn't think that before, but it's the only sense I can make out of the accumulation of problems and the accumulation of dead ends when it comes to trying to think about how to get out of them. It then may be no surprise that you need foreign adventures to distract not only others, but you yourself from the grim prospect of a system going down. Thank you very much for your attention. I do want to remind you, please, if you found this of interest and valuable, share it. Work with us to extend our reach. And for all your support, ideological, political, financial, from all of us at Democracy at Work, thank you. It reinforces our understanding of the important phrase, we can do better than capitalism. Thank you.